Good morning, everyone. My name is Darby Dickerson, and I'm the Dean here at the John Marshall Law School, and I want to welcome you to this bipartisan town hall. We're thrilled to be the host. We are also thrilled to have with us Raja Krishnamoorthi and also our own alum, Representative Darin LaHood, so one we can claim as our own. At this point, I'm going to turn the program over to your moderator, John Williams from WGN Radio. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Dickerson. Hi, I'm John Williams. You can hear me weekdays on WGN Radio. In fact, after this event, I'm heading over to 720 WGN. I'll be on today from 1 to 3. We'll play some of the audio from this on my show today and or on Saturday. I'm on from 10 a.m. till 12 noon. I do not know of another congressional combination that's doing a town hall meeting in the country. Do you? I mean, the story about town hall meetings of late has been that a lot of them don't want to do them at all, solo, among their own constituents, let alone going to each other's home turf. A version of this, as you may know, has happened in Peoria, and subjecting themselves to what you have to say and to what somebody at least politically opposed to them has to say. So thank you for doing this. The format is going to be real simple. I believe Darin's going to go first, as this is sort of, in a way, his home turf. You'll note that he's wearing a blue tie. And I would have predicted Raj was going to wear a red tie.
Hey, that's right.
In the spirit of bipartisan. And as your moderator, I have red speckles on my blue tie. So we're here about civility, but we're also here about talking about the current events, and we'll give you a chance to answer some questions as well. Congressman LaHood.
Well, thank you, John, and thank all of you for being here today. It's a pleasure to be back at John Marshall Law School. I graduated here in 1997. I took a lot of finals in here, so it brought back a few nightmares of sitting in this room. And it was funny, when we walked in today, somebody was asking me, well, who are some of your favorite professors? And I said, well, I love Professor Luzine, and there she walked right in, and then she said, should we get out your grade book? And I said, no, let's wait and see how it goes first. So thank you, Professor, for at least waiting till afterwards. But I have very fond memories of being here at John Marshall. Very proud of my degree that I got here at John Marshall. I graduated for undergrad in Iowa, and then I worked for about 4.5 years before I started to go to law school. I'd worked in D.C. as a staffer and then moved back here and attended John Marshall. And I knew I wanted to be a prosecutor when I went to John Marshall, and really had some quality professors here and a great education. I went on to work in the Cook County State's Attorney's Office for about 3 years. And then I moved back to Peoria, and I worked as a felony prosecutor there. And then I spent 5 years in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Las Vegas, Nevada. And I'll just tell you, there's no lack of business in Las Vegas, Nevada as a federal prosecutor. But the education I got here was really the foundation for the career that I had as a prosecutor. And then I practiced law in Peoria at a private law firm for about 8 years. And then I served in the Illinois State Senate for 4 years, from 2011 to 2015. And I tell people I wasn't planning to run for Congress, but in 2015, my predecessor abruptly resigned, and so we jumped in and ran and got elected. So I'm honored to represent my district. As I look out here, none of you can vote for me because you're not, well, one, Dave Bender actually is here from Logan County, but the district that I represent is the 18th district. It's 19 counties, central, west central Illinois. Peoria, Illinois is my hometown. My wife and I, we have 3 boys, 16, 14, and 11. And we just got a driver, so as of last week, so stay off the roads in Peoria, at least for a couple months, if you can. And then our district covers the Peoria area, Bloomington Normal, Springfield, Jacksonville, Quincy, Macomb. So I border Missouri and Iowa on the western part of my district, and it's a heavy ag district. Of the 435 congressional districts, ours is the 8th largest in terms of corn and soybean production. We got some of the most fertile farmland in the entire world. I love telling people that 96% of the pumpkins produced in the world come from my district. So next time you're having a piece of pumpkin pie or a pumpkin latte, most likely originated in our district there. Blessed to have some wonderful companies there. State Farm Insurance is in my district. Caterpillar for 94 years has been in Peoria. John Deere is right on the outskirts of our district, and of course representing the state capitol in Springfield. So it's a great district to represent. The other thing is the political history of the district that I represent. So Abraham Lincoln represented this district. Before he was ever President Abraham Lincoln, he was Congressman Abraham Lincoln, 1847 to 1849. He represented 9 counties. I now represent all 9 of those counties, and he's buried in my district in Oak Ridge Cemetery in Sangamon County in Springfield. Everett Dirksen, who was a senator from Pekin, Illinois, served in this seat before he became a U.S. Senator. Bob Michael, for 38 years, represented this district. There was another LaHood in this district at one time, too. And so I'm proud of that history in the district of those people that came before. And again, honored to serve the district that I do. And it's a real pleasure to be here with my friend Raja here today. Bipartisanship is lacking these days, I think, in Washington, D.C. And so Raja and I have become friends. What's the connection? Peoria is the connection. Raja will tell you about himself, but he's born and raised in Peoria. His mother and father are my constituents. His dad's a professor at Bradley. And when they have problems, his mom and dad, they call me. They don't call their own son. So I have to deal with that. But when we first met, when he got elected, we talked all about Peoria, Illinois, where we were raised at, our families, and we have formed a relationship. Doesn't mean we agree on every issue. I'm a Republican, he's a Democrat. I'm probably as conservative as he is liberal, but we've tried to come together on issues that we think are important. Raja's been at the forefront of career technical education, working in our high schools and vocational schools, and I've been working with him on that. I have a bill that how we reform the Congress of tomorrow it's called. How do we reform ourselves and make us a better institution? Issues related to opioids and some issues on immigration. We've tried to work together. And so I know we hear a lot about partisanship in D.C., and there's plenty of it, but we've tried to bridge that just with our friendship and our relationship moving forward. And so it's, again, a real pleasure to be with you here today. Look forward to a good dialogue and discussion today, and look forward to your questions. So thank you so much for having me.
Well done. Congressman Krishnamoorthi, you want to say hello?
Hi. I'm so honored to be here. First of all, thank you to Dean Dickerson and John Marshall Law School for having today's event. I want to say a special thank you to John Williams for moderating, and of course to Darin, my dynamic partner here. This is our second time doing this. I'll tell you a little bit about my background. I was actually born in India and came here when I was 3 months old to the United States. Things started going really well until they didn't. Unfortunately, in the recession of 1973, my parents kind of hit the economic skids. But thanks to the incredible generosity and goodwill of the people of the United States and his government, we were allowed to enter public housing and food stamps. And so I spent about half of my early childhood in those 2 programs. But thanks to the incredible goodwill of the people of the United States, we were allowed to stay until my father could find his first and only real permanent job in, of all places, Peoria, Illinois. And so I think they accepted the job before they found out where it was. They unfurled the map. They loaded up the U-Haul truck in New York State and then started driving and driving and driving until they reached Peoria. And that marked the turning point in our lives. That became the golden period of our lives because that's where they educated their 2 children in wonderful public schools. That's where they bought their first middle-class home. And that's where they entered the middle class. And so literally every night, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but my father would say something along the lines of, think of the greatness of this country. And whatever the 2 of you do, my brother and me, just make sure that this country is there for the next families who need it. And so that became kind of the North Star of my personal compass. And it became my silent promise and pledge to fulfill that mission in life. And so now I've come full circle, and I got elected from the 8th Congressional District of Illinois, which are basically all the suburbs west and northwest of O'Hare International Airport, including the runways, but not the terminal. And we can talk about gerrymandering if you wish. But I represent all those suburbs, a wonderful place. 30% of the residents are foreign-born, and these aren't just people of color. It's a huge concentration of Eastern European immigrants, Polish and Russians and so forth. But we also have a fair number of Indian Americans. About 8% of the district is from South Asia. But it's also a high concentration of light manufacturing and small businesses. So these are people that really care about making sure that we are a country that's welcoming of folks from other places, but at the same time, a place that is vibrant in terms of its commercial activities and so forth. This is I mentioned this is the second time we're doing this. The first time came about when I said to Darin, hey, I'm coming to visit my parents. And he said, hey, you want to do something at Bradley together? And I said, sure. And that turned into a joint town hall meeting at Bradley. I was a little nervous going into it, quite frankly, but I was incredibly pleased with how civil the discussion was. The questions were pointed, but it was civil and respectful. And in a time when we're kind of living in kind of turbulent waters politically, I think it's so important that even though we may take principled stands on issues, that we're able to talk about it in a way where we can disagree without being disagreeable. And so there are certain issues where we have worked together. My passion is career technical education and workforce development in this Congress, but we also work on various other issues together, and I really look forward to kind of discussing these and whatever else is on your mind as well. And thank you for pronouncing my name correctly. I should tell you one last thing. When I first was campaigning, I introduced myself to someone, I think here in Chicago. I said, hi, my name is Raja Krishnamoorthi. And the person said, Roger Christian Murphy. Very nice to meet you. Didn't know the Irish made it to India. So anyway, thank you so much.
Yeah, we told people to just Google Congressman Raja because that would be a little bit easier anyway. Okay, well, let's get at some of the stories that are in the news. You guys have suggested that we do this, and I think it's a good idea, too. We've all been talking about the immigration crisis. Over the weekend, the president said that we should deport without judges or court cases. Darin, what about the zero-tolerance policy that maybe we backed away from a little bit, but has been the Trump administration's position on this issue? What do you make of zero tolerance at the border?
I'll reference that in a second here. I'll just say, my family history, my great-grandparents came from Lebanon and immigrated to Peoria, Illinois. So we have a large Lebanese population in Peoria, and most of them immigrated over the last 100 years from Lebanon. My great-grandparents came through Ellis Island. Story of many of our ancestors who didn't speak any English, didn't have any money, came off a agrarian village in I-2 Lebanon, a small little village near Tripoli, got on a boat and took the long journey to America. They wound up in central Illinois because of coal mining at the time, about 100 years ago, and then wound up in Peoria. Focused on education and working hard, and I'm the beneficiary a couple generations later. So that story is profound with me and with a lot of our relatives that we brought from Lebanon. When we think about where we're at now, first of all, separating families at the border was not a long-term solution, nor should it be. So I'm glad the president issued the executive order last week, John, with immigration and what we do. The legal framework that we have in place, first of all, you have to give people due process, and that takes time. That takes judges, that takes personnel, that takes process to do that. So we cannot negate the legal process. Do we not have enough judges? No. Do we not have enough of a process in place? We do not. But, so I tell you that in the sense that we have to make sure that we up our due process system when it comes to the border. Now, I will tell you, I have a pretty conservative district. And people, I've said I don't support a wall, but I do think we need to secure our border. I think some fencing, some barriers, we have to fix our southern border. and we have to secure our border so we stop the flow of coming across the border. I think there's many things we can do after we secure the border, but that has to be a part of it. And I don't think that's a partisan issue on how you do that, but you have to have resources and money to do that along the border. Let me also mention our legal immigration system has to change. Right now, we let in about 1.1 legal immigrants every year. And if anybody's been to a naturalization ceremony, and I know they have them across the street here and all over, they're wonderful ceremonies. You see people that did everything that they were supposed to do. They go back to their country of origin, they pass a background check, they pay a fee, they do everything, and they come here, and they end up being our best citizens. Best citizens here. And so we need to expand that, and we can do that with an economy that's doing better from 1.1 and go up. And we have to streamline that. It takes way too long to become a citizen. It shouldn't take 3 or 4 years. So we need to streamline that system, and that's part of what immigration reform is all about. Again, I think that's a bipartisan issue that I support. And then lastly, we've talked a lot about this, going to a more skills-based or more merit-based system. So right now, of those 1.1 million that come into the country, only about 8% is based on skill or merit. Now, most of the other countries in the world that have generous immigration systems, that's way higher. For instance, Canada, it's about 60% is based on skills and merit. And when you think about computer engineers and people in medicine that want to come to this country, I think we have to increase that level. I don't know what that is. Is that 25%? Is that 30%? Is that 40%? But I think that is a common sense approach that we need to take with legal immigration. And that's another issue. Again, there's a bipartisan bill that's been introduced by Congressman Yoder of Kansas that would help with that, more merit-based or skills-based when it comes to immigration. But that has to be part of the system as we move forward. So there's a lot of issues on the table, and we have to take care of DACA. Actually, I think, if you remember, the president came out with his proposal about 3 months ago. What did he say? Not only the 800,000, but 1.8 million can come into this country, but you got to have 25 billion for border security. And if you remember when that came out, who was upset? The far right was upset, the far left was upset. No one was happy. I think that's a pretty good place to start in terms of securing the border and then figuring out a pathway for folks to come in.
Raj?
So first of all, thank you for your comments about increasing legal. You're one of the few people that I know on the other side who's been really calling for an increase in legal immigration, and I think that's a very nice statement on your part. I think that, folks, we live in a nation of laws, but we also live in a nation of immigrants, and I think that we have to recognize that the lifeblood of our economy, how we rejuvenate ourselves, comes from immigration. Let's talk about what's happened most recently on the border. I found how the Trump administration handled this particular situation to be deplorable. I found that separating children and parents is not the American thing to do. I was glad to see that that is no longer going to happen. However, the executive order calls for the creation of internment camps where there could be, and it doesn't say this in the executive order, but it doesn't prohibit indefinite detention on military bases. In fact, today, Secretary Mattis announced that 2 military bases would be constructing some of these internment camps. I find that to be wrong. A, the military should not be in the business of immigration, and then B, we have a history where even as late as 70 years ago, in World War II, we had internment camps for Japanese Americans. Later, President Ronald Reagan apologized to these people for the quote-unquote grave injustice that we did to them, and we can't repeat that mistake that we made in history. We just can't. Now, how do we move forward? I would like to see, a number of changes made. With regard to these folks on the border, I've introduced something called the Keep Families Together Act. That's something that has been introduced in the Senate by Dianne Feinstein, and in the House, I'm one of the original co-sponsors of that bill. Basically, it's the idea that we always keep families together. If there is proceedings, such as asylum proceedings and so forth, we should first process those, and then in the meantime, we should have maybe some restrictions on the movement of people through and monitoring them through ankle bracelets and so forth. That is something that's used. It's better than keeping people in indefinite detention and so forth. Going to the bigger question of long-term immigration reform, we have to do this together. First, we have to allow the dreamers a path to citizenship in this country. They are everything that you and I are in terms of being Americans, except they don't have papers to say that. They're some of the finest people you'll ever meet. We have to give them a path. And then we also have to treat those who've come here, who are here illegally, with dignity and respect. And we have to make sure that we allow them to come out of the shadows and participate in our economy. Ultimately, I would say it's not only the morally right thing to do, it's good for our economy. This is so important that we get this right, because these people, again, are going to be the investors, the consumers, the taxpayers, and they're going to be the innovators in our economy. Unlike some other countries that have a more closed system, America has always been at the forefront of economic and technological progress because of our immigrants. And so let's welcome that. Let's welcome that, and let's do it together.
Congressman LaHood, I'd like to know if you think that your position would be easier to defend or sell or actually implement if the president would dial down some of his rhetoric. Do his statements make your job more difficult?
Well, I don't always like the way the president speaks and the language he uses, but you also have to remember this is something, I mean, in some ways shouldn't surprise us. I mean, the president ran on this issue when he ran for president. He beat 16 Republican candidates in the primary and talked about this on securing our borders. He talked about building a wall, right? Again, I mentioned earlier, I don't know that the wall is the answer, but securing the borders. So, you know, this is something that was a campaign theme of his doing it. Again, you know, and I think it's changed the dialogue that we're having in Washington, D.C. about securing the border and doing that. So, again, I think that there's a lot of support out there for immigration reform. I think it surprised a lot of people, again, when he said that we do need to fix the DACA, have a solution to DACA when it comes to that. Again, I don't always like the tweets. I don't like the language and how he does it, but I do think he's moving the ball forward in terms of having a conversation. I mean, last week in the House, we voted on a bill. We got 196 votes on an immigration bill. Weren't able to pass it. There's some thought this week we'll have a vote on a more moderate bill. So I think we're making incremental progress and having a discussion and a debate about this. But it's complicated. I also will tell you this, John. I think the time to do immigration reform is when the economy is doing well. Mm-hmm. Economy is doing well now. I mean, we get into this when the economy is not good. You know, no one, you know, people get defensive about immigrants and taking jobs and those things. We have an economy that is really on the upswing, healthy and robust. We got more people working in this country than ever before. I think now is the timing to do that. We're going to have 3% growth, maybe 3% plus over the next 2 quarters. I think there's a window here to get that done, and I think there's a lot of good energy moving in that direction, and I hope we can get across the finish line.
Yeah. This is the cover of Time magazine this week. That's the president and that little girl. She was seeking asylum, which is a specific act, although her mother wasn't doing it correctly. Is this fair, Raj? Is this fair? Time magazine has the president superimposed next to that little girl. Welcome to America is the headline. Is that a fair way to treat the president or this issue on the cover of Time?
Let me address that by addressing something that you said to Darin. And I have never heard Darin use some of the language that the president has used on Twitter, which I find to be very, I find it to be unacceptable. You know, saying that immigrants are invading the country, or that they're infesting the country. I think when he does that, he's creating an atmosphere where it's very hard for people to talk about this issue in a rational, respectful way. And so that's why you see a cover like that, where, you know, this child is screaming her head off after being separated from her parents, and you know, we have the president there juxtaposed next to her. I really think that we have to approach this in a much different way than we are right now. If the White House or if President Trump continues to tweet and talk about this issue in this manner, I think that the sides are going to dig in. And that is not what we need. We need people to come together. I hope that someone takes his smartphone away from him for a little while we discuss this very important issue.
Well, that's why I asked Congressman LaHood that's why I bring this subject up. I do think your job would be a lot easier if the president would dial back the rhetoric, if he would not use words like infest and things like that. I don't know what the solution to the immigration situation is. I don't know that any of us in this room do, but I know that that sort of language doesn't help. I don't think that makes what you're doing here any easier.
Well, I would just say, any job there, Ian, to be successful, you have to be focused, you have to be disciplined, and you have to want to try to work together. And I think there's many examples where he's been able to do that with our economy and on international affairs. But I kind of look at the president, the president's been a Democrat, he's been a Republican. I look at him as kind of a disruptor, is kind of the approach that he takes. And it is, again, it's not the language I would use or most Republicans would use. But, I think it's gotten the attention, it's raised the level, but to be constructive and get to the point, we're going to have a dialogue that, lends itself to finding a bipartisan solution on it.
Lots of questions from your note cards, and I'm going to ask the gentleman to respond to them. We have about 30 minutes left. Let's quickly, although that's ridiculous because these topics are all important, but let's talk a little bit about trade. Raj, what's your thought about how we handle trade imbalances, and what do you think of the administration's position on this? Or what should the Congress be doing about this?
Great question. I think that, I think that we have to maintain a free and fair and level playing field on trade. I think that it's important for the economy of Central Illinois, which is where I'm from, which is where Darin represents, but it also is important for our region. I think that the president, in some ways, represents the views of a lot of Americans when he says that we need to have we need to have a level playing field, and we don't want other people to abuse the privilege of trading or doing business in America. But I would just say that we should approach these concerns on a multilateral basis as opposed to a unilateral basis. I'll just give you an example. If we do it on a unilateral basis, what happens is that another country might slap tariffs. If we impose tariffs on another country's products, they then slap counterbalancing tariffs on our products within their own market. And while it may have felt good doing that, what it does is it then gives an opening to our competitors in other countries to then undercut us on price in those markets, in those foreign markets. And they get also the benefit of whatever we were trying to do in the first place. So I think we should do it in a multilateral way in terms of expressing our concerns and negotiating. I don't think it should be done, again, it shouldn't be done through social media, and I think we shouldn't do it unilaterally, although I do think the president is probably in the right place in terms of demanding a level playing field.
Go ahead.
My district benefits greatly from international trade, whether it's corn and soybeans. 50% of the corn and soybeans grown in Central Illinois go somewhere else around the world. So we have to have markets, we have to have customers. We forget we're 4.5% of the world's population, right? We live in the greatest country of the world, but we have to have markets around the world for our Caterpillar tractors, our Boeing planes, our corn and soybeans to go. And that's, my district's directly affected by that. 70% of the Caterpillar tractors made in East Peoria, Illinois go somewhere else around the world. And they're the best in the world. But again, we have to have agreements with these countries. And I'll go back. The president talked a lot about this when he ran, right? I think that's why he got a lot of support in kind of the Rust Belt, right? Places like Ohio and Pennsylvania and Michigan, because he tapped into something. People felt neglected. He talked about America first, and that resonated with people, and he was able to pick that up. And so, but I put myself more in the free trader category. And I worry about the protectionist of building walls up around this country. I don't think that's good. But I will tell you this, I think the Chinese for 20 years have been ripping us off. forced technology transfers, stealing our intellectual property, a lot of what they've done in cyber with our military assets. They have done that. And presidents for 20 years have tried to take them on. President Bush and President Obama and President Clinton before that, and nothing's been able to be done. And so the president, I think, has tapped into a nerve here that people support him, going after the Chinese and trying to rectify this. So, but it's a balance. And Raja, I think you put it well. You have to have a balance when you go into this, because you don't want to end up in a trade war, because nobody wins in a trade war. We are going to lose in a trade war if we get into that. And so it's a balance. And I think we can buffer it a little bit with a good economy, but we got to be able to land this plane eventually. And that's what I worry a little bit about, because there are some protectionists in this White House that have a different approach. Look at TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership. Again, negotiated prior to the president, but he made a decision to rip it up on day one. I think that was a mistake to do. I supported TPP. NAFTA, 1/3 of the products grown and produced here in Illinois go to Mexico or Canada. 98% of the corn that goes to Mexico comes from the United States, much of it from Illinois. So we are directly tied to these trade agreements. And so I think we got to be very, very careful about going too far, because it's going to disrupt that global supply chain. The other thing that I will mention is I think there's some that think this protectionist will help bring plants back to the United States. I just don't see that happening. We're not going to go back to the smoke-filled steel mills and smelters that we had 30 or 40 years ago. That's just not going to happen. I don't know anybody that says, oh, I want my kid to go through college and then I want him to go work in the steel mill anymore. It's just, that's not something that we have that's not a thought that we have for our kids. Now that happens other places in the world, there's no doubt. China, Pakistan, India, other places around the world, that's happening. But we're in a different era now, and so this trade issue is going to be a vitally important moving on. The last thing I will say is, I think we shouldn't be taking the unilateral approach. I think we ought to be teaming up with our European allies, with the Canadians, with the Japanese, and going after the Chinese, and doing it in a precision way. We're going to be stronger together going after the Chinese and holding them accountable. We're not doing that now. And if you look at the rationale that we were basing the steel and aluminum tariffs on, it's on national security. I just don't think that holds any weight, that somehow there's a national security threat because we import Honda cars, right? It's just, that's not, or cars from Europe. So I think that's a deficiency in our argument with trade. And I'm the sponsor of a bill in Congress right now with some Democrats and Republicans that would take some of the authority of trade back to the Congress. I think we need to be more involved. For a long time, going back to Hoot Smalley, we have deferred and given a lot of that authority to the executive branch. I think we need to take some of that back and be involved with trade policy, particularly as it involves national security as a basis.
Raja, I want to move on to some other questions, but I suspect you agree with a lot that he just had to say.
I do. Yeah, this is an area of, I think, bipartisan agreement, and I hope that folks in the White House administration listen.
First question is, what strategies do you foresee for addressing climate change and protecting the environment for future generations? Where's a bipartisan solution for this, Raj?
Oh, okay. Well, thank you. Before I came to this job, I ran a small business for about 10 years. We make and sell, among other things, solar technology. And so this is an area of great interest to me. And interestingly, I believe America can help lead the solar revolution that's happening around the world. And so in Congress, I formed a bipartisan caucus with Ralph Norman of South Carolina, and it's called the Bipartisan Congressional Solar Caucus. First time it's happened to our knowledge. And when I approached him about this, I said, I'm interested in this. What do you think? And he signed on right away. And we couldn't be more different. Ralph is a conservative Republican from South Carolina, and his name is Ralph. I'm a progressive Democrat from Illinois, and my name is not Ralph. And yet we came together for one reason, and that is solar energy promises to help create an incredible number of jobs and an enormous amount of wealth for the United States, okay? And so this is something that I think has not been emphasized enough, which is that in the fight against global climate change, or however you want to describe it, there are incredible economic opportunities for being first movers in renewable energies. We are a leader in solar, we're a leader in wind energy as well, and if we continue to foster our leadership in these areas, there's going to be an enormous amount of green jobs created, and that's only a good news story for the United States.
What do you tell the coal miners in Pennsylvania then, or West Virginia?
Yeah, I think that we have coal miners in Illinois, actually, in deep southern Illinois. I think they know this, and I think that we have to do everything we can to sustain their families and help them as they go through this transition. Regardless of what we do on Capitol Hill or in Congress, there is a transition happening already. Natural gas is already basically taking over in terms of a lot of the fossil fuel energy demands that coal used to supply.
Well, I'm thinking of Darin's response to this, because the president sure did speak to that, obviously not so much in Illinois, but in those states. What's your thought on that, Congressman?
Well, a couple things. I think we have to have a diversified energy portfolio. That includes coal, that includes fossil fuels, that includes wind. In the district that I represent,
Solar.
of course, solar. But we have to have a diversified energy portfolio. I mean, that's what's going to make us competitive. And, you know, I worry a little bit about the government getting involved and playing games on this, but I think I look at a number of the coal companies and I look at the fossil fuel companies. They've made a lot of progress through the free enterprise system on competition on cleaner energy. I mean, we've made so much progress when it comes to cleaner energy. It's not a story that gets talked about a lot. But whether it's solar or wind or whether it's fossil fuels, you know, letting the marketplace direct this, I think, is the best approach to take instead of having the government involved with that. And listen, you have to have common sense regulations. There's no doubt about it. Reasonable regulations and monitor it and hold the bad actors accountable. But I think we have some of the brightest, smartest people working in engineering and other places in this country. I think we have the ability to have, again, a very diversified energy portfolio and let the marketplace decide where that goes. Natural gas. You look at you know, the technology we've done with fracking. So there is a lot. And listen, nobody ever thought we'd become energy independent. We're energy independent in this country now because of all those things, that technology and that creativeness that's out there. I was also going to tell you, my congressional district has a huge amount of wind. We have 4 wind projects that are going up right now, working with our agriculture community and farms to do that. We have the second most amount of wind projects here in the state of Illinois. So I support that. And then lastly, let me just say on climate change, you know, the climate is changing. I think, you know, having a debate, human interaction, is that 50% cause of that? Is that 90% cause of that? Is that 25% cause of that? I don't know. I'm interested. I'm open-minded on listening to smart, bright people, scientists and otherwise, to figure that out. And then you know, figuring out where we go direction-wise from there. But you know, I'm not with people that are on the far left on that think the world is ending. I'm just not in that category. And I don't think our agreements around the world have held the Chinese accountable or the Indians accountable or other places that continue to pollute.
We should have pulled out of the Paris Accord?
Listen, the president talked about that when he ran. That's his directive to do it. You know, so he made a decision to do that, and that's
Do you
something.
support that decision?
Do I support that decision? I support the president and his ability to do that. Listen, I think that that is something that a decision that can be made by him. And you know, I think, again, some of the restrictions and requirements that are in there that are on us, but not on other third world countries around the world that continue to pollute the world, you know, I think that's a problem.
So a couple of the questions from our crowd here are asking about facts. How do we achieve a bipartisan approach to public policy if we cannot even agree on the facts? Should members of Congress do more to create objective truth? I don't know what you have to say about that. You don't have to say anything, but I think that's one of the things in the room too. The media, the president don't agree on the facts. I don't know if you two are sometimes at loggerheads, not on policy, but on facts. But Raj, the question was, how do we achieve bipartisan public policy if we can't agree on the facts?
Well, I got to go. Look, this is one of the biggest challenges that we have, which is, honestly, I think Darin and I could probably agree on some objective facts, and then maybe we go in totally different directions on the policies to handle those. But right now, we are having a challenge to whether or not, certain facts are even accepted. I'd like to see a situation where, for instance, I'll just give you an example. The CBO has actually, I thought, done a good job of calling balls and strikes on a number of bills that have come to our attention and on which we've voted.
Congressional Budget Office.
Congressional Budget Office, thank you, a CBO. And it has done a really good job in that regard. And I'd like to see some, and this is where we can talk about your bill. I've joined on to a bill that Darin initiated to reform Congress. Who wants to reform Congress? I think every hand in the room goes up. Basically, we need some objective umpires, in my humble opinion, that start to call balls and strikes that we have to listen to as part of the reform process. Darin is calling for a 24-member commission, 12 Democrats, 12 Republicans, to reform Congress. I'd like to see one of the things that's discussed. What are some of the baseline facts that we have to agree to before we, or that are submitted to us as we make policy? I have various other thoughts on reforming Congress, but this is something that we have to talk about.
Well, a couple things. Everything in government, we need to figure out how we reform it, make it more efficient, effective, and accountable. That includes Congress. And, I will also tell you, I've been a strong supporter of term limits. I'm a supporter of term limits in Congress. I was in the state Senate. I'm a strong supporter of redistricting reform. I've been a strong proponent of the fair map here in Illinois. I think you look around the country where redistricting reform has been implemented. It's had a positive effect on democracy and engagement and new people being involved, and I continue to be a strong supporter. The bill that I've introduced called the Congress of Tomorrow, and what I've said is, and it's a bipartisan bill, Raja's on it, Dan Lipinski is my co-sponsor. What we've said is Congress is broken, right? Whatever statistics, 11% think Congress is doing a good job, right? I mean, it's really pathetically low. And so what we've said is, how do we fix the institution of Congress? And this isn't necessarily a new idea. So this has been done 3 times before, 1944, 1966, and 1992, where we've put together a joint committee in Congress to figure out how we reform ourselves. Right now, we don't have a platform, a committee, a mechanism to bring these ideas to be debated, to talk, to get into dialogue and discussion about them. So what we've said is, let's create this panel, 12 Democrats, 12 Republicans, half from the Senate, half from the House. Let's meet for 1 year and figure out what our, and I don't necessarily go in with any preconceived notions, but Raja just raised a couple issues. There's about 40 or 50 ideas that are out there that my colleagues have talked about. By the way, we have about 80 co-sponsors of our bill, half Democrats, half Republicans. We purposely don't have anybody from leadership on it. It's really the newer members that want to reform the institution. We got some very conservative Freedom Caucus members. We have very liberal Bernie Sanders types that want to do the same thing. And so what we've said is, let's create this committee, and then let's have these ideas brought. Maybe you want to change the budget process, the appropriations process. We haven't passed a budget on time since 1996. We haven't passed all 12 appropriations bills since 1998. So there are many reforms that need to be done. People have talked about we need to change the filibuster. Maybe a good idea, maybe a bad idea. But let's have a discussion and a debate on how we reform ourselves. And so we hope to get this set up as we move into the next Congress next year and meet on this and then bring those reforms back. Now, in 1992 when this was done, they came up with 34 ideas on how you fix the institution of Congress. Almost all of those were implemented. Again, from 1994 through 98, we passed all 12 appropriations bills on time. We had many things that helped Congress function better. This is the time we think to do that. And so I'm optimistic that this will move forward and we'll get it done. We have a lot of strong support for it now. But that's one way, John, I think, to change how we do things in Congress and figuring out how we have more engagement, working together to change the institution.
Raj, unemployment is low. The market's wobbled lately. In fact, we're down for the year, but it's sure gone up since Donald Trump became president. But wages aren't great for a lot of people. And the concern is that while unemployment is low, wages are not high enough. Does Congress have a role in this? And how healthy would you assess the economy? Should we be championing and cheerleading what's going on, or do we need to do more to get more money in people's pockets?
Absolutely. The answer is yes. Unfortunately, I think obviously the economy appears to be strong. The stock market is rising, but the gains are not widely shared or shared enough among all strata of society. One thing that Congress needs to do, I think, is to raise the national minimum wage. Right now it's $7.25. I dare anybody in this room to figure out how you live on $7.25 and a full-time job. You can't. I don't think you can have a family, certainly. Long-term, one of the things that I'd like to see is much more participation in workforce development and career technical education, upgrading by the federal government. So this is where I'm going to put a plug in for my bill. There's something called the Perkins Career Technical Education System or program. This is the primary vehicle for funding career technical education around the country. This is the idea that maybe a four-year college degree may not be for everybody, but a post-secondary education has to be. You have to get a skill, a credential, a certification, something to get access to the greatest anti-poverty program devised by human beings, a JOB, a job. There are 6.7 million unfilled jobs in the current economy because employers can't locate the skills or experience necessary to fill them. Meanwhile, 1/3 of Americans have a four-year college degree, but 2/3 do not, okay? And those numbers are not changing anytime soon. So here is the challenge. How do we equip those 2/3 of Americans who are not going to complete a four-year college degree with the skills to take these 6.7 million unfilled jobs? If we can do that, then we will take our economy to a new level, and we will do something which I pledged to my parents that I would do, which is grow and strengthen the middle class. I'll just close with one anecdote. I love to share this anecdote. There was this plumber who went to this attorney's home the other day and did some work. And he handed the attorney the bill. And the attorney took one look at the bill and said, "Oh my God, your hourly wages are higher than mine." And so then the plumber took one look at the attorney and one look at the bill and said, "You're right. Those charges are higher than what I used to charge when I was an attorney." We need to right-size our skill set as a country. We have an abundance of great attorneys who graduated from places like John Marshall Law School, but we have a shortage of plumbers, of solar panel installers, cybersecurity experts, claims analysts at insurance companies, and so forth. And that is the challenge, John. If we can I might be simplistic and naive about these things, you put a little more money in people's pockets, okay? You widen their perspective on all kinds of other issues, from trade to immigration to how we handle our foreign relationships and so forth. And I think that's really important.
Lots there. Darin, do respond to, should we raise the minimum wage?
Well, I think the minimum wage being raised, listen, I represent Peoria, Illinois. If Chicago wants to raise the minimum wage in Chicago to $15 or $16 an hour, God bless them, they ought to do it. But it shouldn't be in Peoria, Illinois. So I'm a big believer in locals ought to decide. I mean, we are a very large, diverse country, and so I'm not in favor of the federal minimum wage. I think local officials, if the city council in Peoria wants to raise that to $12 an hour, they should do that. But you know, every place is different. I represent a lot of small communities and small towns. And by the way, it is $7.25. In Illinois, it's $8.25, so we're $1 above. But where locals want to do that, we in Washington, D.C. shouldn't be blanketing the country with minimum wage on what it should be. Let locals decide how to do it. I think it's worked fairly well. Whether, you know, again, you're in Springfield, Illinois or Bloomington Normal, in terms of raising the minimum wage. I think democracy at the local level is best left to do that. And I think that we've seen that play out, and you've seen that happen with the economy. So I think that's the best approach to take on that.
I have one more question here. Just so you all know, I appreciate all your questions. I know they do too, and I can share these with them. They can respond maybe on their pages, or at least it's nice that they know what your concerns are. But just for the room, I'll mention that a lot of the questions that you all have submitted to us here are about climate and climate change. And Raj, are you doing enough? And Darin, are you doing enough about climate change? What does that mean to jobs if we are too hard on fossil fuel industries? So I'd say they're partisan both ways, but that's obviously a concern in the room. And then there's a lot of concern here about the president's behavior, and are we allowing us to create a dictator? I'll let you folks respond to that if you like, but the last question here is for Congressman Krishnamoorthi, and then Mr. LaHood, if you'd respond too. What are your perspectives on the Inspector General's report? We haven't talked at all, by the way, about the witch hunt or the investigation too. Just comment on that briefly, if you would.
Sure. So I actually sit on the Oversight Committee in the House, and I actually thought that the Inspector General report was balanced. I thought it was largely well done. I think that the interesting thing is I think that people on both sides had ample ammunition to go after Jim Comey. In this regard, that he injected himself into the political process way too much in the 2016 election. Obviously, the president believes that he should have not closed the investigation into Hillary Clinton, but my side believes that he should not have reopened the investigation into Hillary Clinton, I think 8 days before the election. I think it was around October 28th, 2016. And of course, partisans on both sides believe that whatever was done was wrong. And on our side, we think that sank her chances to get elected, okay? So he broke with protocol, processes, procedures, and I think he did the wrong thing in conducting himself in that election. That being said, I've reviewed hundreds and hundreds of these text messages between Strzok and Page and so forth. They were unprofessional. They don't like politicians. They didn't like Hillary Clinton. They didn't like Donald Trump. They wouldn't like me if they knew me, probably. The point is that I didn't see any kind of conspiracy, and I think that's what Inspector General Horowitz came to the conclusion on as well.
Couple things. Obviously, I mentioned earlier, I was proud of my work at U.S. Department of Justice. And I will just tell you this, we need institutions in our government like the FBI and like the Department of Justice that are independent, that function the way they do, and they uphold the rule of law. And we have to make sure as a Congress and as a government that we keep those institutions independent and strong for the rule of law. That's the bottom line. I've read most of the report by Horowitz. Listen, I have real concerns about Jim Comey and what he did. I think he got way outside of his lane in terms of what the FBI should be involved with, they should be doing. Their traditional, their kind of traditional role in what they do. I think he got way outside of it. Now, was that due to Loretta Lynch, recusing herself, and so he got thrown into that? Regardless, I just think. And I don't think going on a book tour and doing everything, that's not what our FBI directors do. So for a lot of reasons, I lost respect for Comey. I read these text messages. It's really concerning to me that you're doing an investigation and you have FBI agents, engaged in a relationship, but also clearly exhibiting bias in the investigation. I think that, again, it goes against everything we believe in, and we want FBI agents that are nonpartisan, that are non-political, that are following the facts and evidence, and they aren't biased. And that leaves me really concerned when I read that report and see what happens there. Now, long term, have I seen anything in there that causes me to believe that there was some type of collusion there or something? Not at this point, but again, it's really concerning when you have an investigation going on that, where you had people with clear opinions. And listen, I don't think this is over yet, and there's a lot of people upset by it moving forward. We have to make sure we learn from this, right? That's the best thing. We have to take that Inspector General's report, make sure we reform DOJ, reform FBI. I think Chris Wray is doing that. We have to make sure that we change things so we don't have this happen again. Listen, that's the greatness about our country, right? We learn from our mistakes, hopefully reform them in government. We have to hold them accountable as members of Congress and make sure we get this on track so we don't have this happen again.
Every Republican member of the Illinois delegation signed a letter to the president asking that former Governor Blagojevich's sentence not be commuted. You were a signatory to that. Would you agree with that, Raj?
Right now, here's my issue with Rod Blagojevich, which is that I don't see any remorse. I don't see any kind of regrets. I don't see anything that would lead me to believe that he thought he did anything wrong. And therefore, how can you give a commutation to somebody who doesn't think they deserve to be sentenced to jail in the first place? I think 14 years it seems like a very long time compared to what his peers or others got for doing a similar thing. So I'd be open to potentially lowering that sentence. But this is reserved for a certain situation where I believe the prisoner has really changed their tune and turned over a new leaf. And I don't think that's Rod Blagojevich this moment.
Go ahead.
I have real concerns about the president even thinking about commuting the sentence of Rod Blagojevich and or pardoning him. We've been fighting public corruption in this state for a long time. We hate using the statistic. 4 of our last 7 governors have gone to prison, right? And I think it would be a total mistake to the fight against public corruption and what we're doing. And so I signed on to that letter. I helped generate that letter. To Raj's point, when you think about commuting the sentence or pardoning someone, it is when somebody admits what they did was wrong, they own up to that, there's remorsefulness. That clearly has not happened. Secondly, remember what happened. The legislature unanimously, Republicans and Democrats impeached him, right? 59-0 in the state Senate. We tend to forget about this because we're kind of immune to it. We're numb to it in the state of Illinois. But the legislature, Democrats impeached him for his behavior. And this, the pay-for-play politics, shaking down hospital executives, shaking down construction CEOs, this is blatant stuff that shouldn't be accepted in any way. And that's what would happen by a computation. And the last thing that I would just say on that is, and we reminded the president of this, his own Solicitor General, when Blagojevich's last appeal went to the U.S. Supreme Court, he found it without merit at all. And there's no allegation at the 7th Circuit appellate level, the en banc 7th Circuit, or the U.S. Supreme Court twice that there was anything improper done by the judiciary, anything improper done by the prosecution, or anything done improperly by law enforcement whatsoever. And so he had his day in court, and if you look at Judge Zagel, who sentenced him, he could have went higher than that under the sentencing guidelines and gave him 14 years. So for all of those reasons, I think it would be a terrible decision to commute his sentence.
Our last question is, John, they need to catch a flight in D.C. Wrap it up. We'll play some of this on WGN Radio. We need more of this, don't we, folks? That's much appreciated.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, guys. It's your schedule, I know, so thank you
you.
for joining us, and thank you for being here.
This was fun.